Okay, I don't know why it's blurry, but it's just gonna be. Testing on YouTube. Is there any sound coming through? Testing on YouTube. Is there any sound coming through?
And you're muted down there.
I'm unmuted here. Well, the computer is YouTube. Is there any sound? Muted. Okay. For sound to come through.
We'll just have to see.
Yeah. Okay. This works.
So your computer is currently muted in the system, right?
This computer. This one.
Yeah.
This is muted. This is muted, but the mic is on.
Yeah, because you only want to unmute this when you're taking a question from Zoom.
Yes.
I just want to let you know if you need help with anything, I'm here.
Okay.
So just flag me down.
Awesome. If maybe at like 1:30, if you want to go out in the outside and see if there's anyone like doing their freshmen or doing anything out there, and kind of welcome them in. I think we're mostly set up. We maybe are just figuring out one more iPad, and then. But otherwise, I think I think this is working.
Better knock on some wood.
I know. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Well, yeah,
I think it's
will
happening.
Swing out there in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks,
Cool.
Levi.
Absolutely.
And then if I'm gonna, I'm also gonna have a, where can I plug this one in?
I hand it to me. I'll take care of it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I need the other half of it.
Maybe you don't have the other half of it. Let's see. Oh, shoot. That's everything I have. I guess maybe in the middle we can switch from one.
Yeah, just keep an eye on it.
Yeah. This is the more critical one. So,
Yes.
so yeah. Okay. Maybe
These are
making
Dells.
it for
I don't
myself
think
for
I have the
tomorrow.
second one. Yeah.
I think otherwise.
Where's the brightness on this?
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn the brightness on the screen down since it doesn't matter. That will help a little bit.
Okay. So, oh yeah. Okay. Okay. How you doing? I'm good.
Are you ready to go? Oh, okay. You're ready to go?
This is it's for the grant. Basically, Michelle and I are basically. I think it's like a it's the worst. I still have. Who are the? Yeah. You were signing that one. Yep.
I'm independent.
That's how you signed it last year. I know. I guess it's at 10% correct. And then the next page. Yeah, it has that important. So, NIH is so much. Well, no, I think NIH is not.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good day so far?
Yeah, very
Still full.
relaxing. I'm definitely do all day.
Oh my God. And then breakfast is the restaurant next door.
Oh, we just say no.
It's really nice. So,
Good. Oh, I see. Right where our group was?
I'll say that way.
So where is that going to be pointed?
Yeah. So, for instance, if you had a question, you can ask them.
Oh, for questions.
Yeah, for questions.
So what about the actual speaker when they're talking?
They're gonna be right there.
Oh, is this going to be on Zoom here?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. I never thought of that. The stadium lighting be different, right? Just throwing that out there.
Yeah. You can turn them down a little bit. Is it possible to turn like those like over there down just a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
little
blow in your face.
Is she our tech expert?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. That is Anna. She's been super helpful.
Terrific.
I did a test yesterday. I did one a couple weeks ago.
Looks like it's meant. It's 2 lights there and it's really odd.
So turn it down, but you don't want too much more down, otherwise you'll be in the dark.
Okay.
And just let me know when you guys are ready and I'll unmute the microphone. And you're not doing the audience mics until halfway through? Towards the end? Okay. So I'm going to leave those muted until you get to that section.
Okay. Okay.
Just so there's no extra.
Terrific. Let's do it.
These are the grad students doing well this morning?
Yeah. Yeah. It was great. It was great. It flew by. Yeah.
Great. It's harder.
I'm just gonna open everybody.
Your podium mic is on when you're ready.
Okay, thank you.
Where do you should I start? Here or should I sit in the-
Let's do that. You take some time to come up.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to what we used to call our annual Kendon Smith lecture series. As you know, we've been on a hiatus for the last couple of years, but we're thrilled to have the series back. The series shines as a signature event, allowing a faculty member to invite the field luminaries for 2 full days of intellectual stimulation and social gatherings. Kudos to this year's organizer, Dr. Jasmine De Jesus, for coordinating the event under very challenging circumstances. This year's topic, Are We What We Eat? An interdisciplinary look at food, culture, and health, truly captures the spirit of the Kendon Smith Lecture Series as a scientifically strong and publicly accessible event. Besides the speakers and attendees here in the auditorium, we have virtual speakers and attendees who will be participating as well. The lecture series got its start in 1984 thanks to a very generous endowment from alumna Janet Balcom. She named the series for Kendon Smith, a longtime faculty member and department head who was retiring at the time. Kendon was honored to have his name associated with this academic proceeding, and he was a regular attendee well into his retirement until his death in 2002. If you browse the lecture series website, you will see a history of the great researchers in psychology. This series has attracted the best of the best, and this year is no exception. We have 4 speakers whose research expertise and strong ability to communicate scientific findings allow us to continue our tradition of excellence. So wherever you are right now, either at home or here in the auditorium, I invite you to sit back, relax, put your thinking caps on, and enjoy the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Hi, everyone, here and across the world in cyberspace. My name is Jasmine De Jesus, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the Fall 2021 Kendon Smith Lecture Series. I'm so excited to be the organizer of this semester's KSL with the theme, Are We What We Eat? An interdisciplinary look at food, culture, and health. I originally considered titling this series a celebration of food, because food is often central to our celebratory experiences. Food is a way to connect with other people, to nurture ourselves and each other. Recipes can connect us with our homes and our loved ones, even those who are far away or no longer with us. Food is a way to express or learn about our cultural backgrounds. Growing up in a bicultural family myself, I knew that certain foods were related to certain people in my family. With some, I'd eat rice and beans and tostones. With others, bagels and laughs. I can think of few things more enjoyable than curating the perfect cheese plate, cooking a delicious meal for people I love, or tasting a perfectly ripe North Carolina peach at the peak of the season. But not every aspect of food is celebratory. Food may not feel celebratory for parents of 2 to 6-year-old children, the age range in which picky eating is especially common. And many people do not have access to nutritious food, especially in our own community. Guilford County has some of the worst food insecurity rates in the country, meaning that nearly 20% of our county does not have regular access to enough nutritious food for a healthy life, including more than 23% of children. The process of creating the food that we eat has consequences for our environment and the pace of climate change. And in the context of COVID-19, grocery stores became scary places to be for a while, and people who work there suddenly became essential frontline workers. So hence a look instead of a celebration. In this series of talks, our speakers will present cutting-edge research that examines food through multiple lenses and levels of analysis. And so today, we'll first hear from Julie Mennella, who will discuss the earliest influences on human food preferences. And later this afternoon, we'll hear from Cynthia Stifter, who will discuss child temperament and the parent-child dynamic in the feeding process. Tomorrow, we will broaden out to more of a societal lens, and we'll hear from Julian Adjaman, who will consider food as an issue of social justice, and Kelly Brownell, who will discuss the levers that are available to translate from the science in our field to policy. I deeply admire all of their work, and I'm so excited to hear from them. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible. First, the KSL committee, including Dr. Janet Basiowski, Levi Baker, Chris Walheim, and Brittany Cassidy, as well as our department head, Stuart Markovich, for helpful advice throughout this process. I'd also like to thank our department staff, Mindy Wolf, Kelsey Hewitt, and Amy Calicut, for all of your help making arrangements for this especially complicated event due to COVID-19, to Anna Gray, who's helping us with the tech today, and to all of our graduate students who have helped out in so many ways, including the many, many tests of the streaming system that I did. Speaking of streaming, I wanted to discuss some procedures to keep our multiple platforms running smoothly. First, I wanted to direct you all to our event website. We have more information there about all of the speakers who will be speaking, as well as a curated syllabus if you're interested in reading more of their work or engaging with more of the content of this event. And I have a QR code up there in case you want to do it that way instead of typing out the link. But that will be available, and there should be some QR codes up and around if anyone wants to check in about that. Okay, so to keep on the subject of keeping our platforms running smoothly, I wanted to discuss a few procedures, especially around question and answer, which is the trickier part of the multi-platform setup. So if you are in person and you're going to ask a question, I would invite you to come up to the microphone to ask your question. I will have a student there who is ready to unmute the iPad so that everyone out there in the world can hear your question as well. So I'm going to point to that student, they will get the iPad ready, and then they will point to you for you to ask your question. Okay, if you're on Zoom and you have a question, you are welcome to post your question in the chat, and I will read it. Or you can raise your hand, use the raise your hand tool, and I will call on you. Try and mix it up between in person and online. And if you're on another form of media, post the question in the comment section there, and I will read it. And I apologize in advance if you don't get to everyone's questions today. Okay, so those are the question and answer protocols. If anyone has a quick question about that, I'll jump ahead. Sure, we'll get into the swing of it when the question and answer period is here. Okay, so with that out of the way, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today. Dr. Julie Mennella obtained a PhD from the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, where I'm very proud to be a fellow alum. She conducted postdoctoral studies and then joined the faculty at the Bonnell Chemical Sciences Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1990, where she is now a member. Dr. Mennella has authored or co-authored numerous peer-reviewed research manuscripts and is an internationally recognized speaker on the development of the flavor senses and its implications for health and nutritional programming. One of my favorite of Dr. Mennella's papers, Prenatal and Postnatal Flavor Learning by Human Infants, has been cited over 1,200 times according to Google Scholar, and is what I often discuss in my classes because students so often ask what factors influence our food preferences, especially students who are parents themselves. Dr. Mennella was recently recognized by the Association for Chemoreception Sciences with the Max Mosel Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Chemical Senses. Her research programs have been funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health since 1990, and I'm so excited to hear what she has to share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Mennella for her talk, We Eat What We Like, Insights from the Beginning.
Well, this is a thrill and an honor. Thank you. And I can't tell you how nice it is to give a talk and not to look at myself in a screen for a Zoom call. But thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. This is truly a big honor to be able to present to you today. Let me see. I don't know if the clicker's working. Let me see. Nope, it's not working. Just gotta get the clicker to go. Okay, there. So just by way of disclosure, my funding is from NIH and I have no conflicts. What you eat remains one of the top risk factors for determining mortality and disability adjusted life years in the world, around the world. I mean, if there's one thing you can do to change risk for disease, it's what you decide to eat. Not only disruptions, but improvements can have immediate and long-term effects without noticing any clinical symptoms. So we really are what we eat, and it really does impact our health. The reality is, and in this talk, I want to talk a lot about the basic science. I'm an experimentalist. That's really where my passion is. But I wanted to try to it was fun to try to think of the big picture when it comes to what we eat. And I was inspired by the title of this series. The reality is that many chronic illnesses that plague modern society derive in large part by our poor food choices. And these are all dictated by the senses that I really enjoy studying: taste and smell. We eat too much salt and sweet and fat. And why is that the case? And so when you look at it, I mean, we both have two types of histories. We've got an evolutionary history that predates us for hundreds of thousands of years. And we also have an individual life course history that starts from the beginning. And so I want to talk about a little bit of both of those, and Dr. Stifter is going to talk about more about the individual perspective. But when you think about nutrition or think about food, and you look at it from this big picture, it's really a basic biological commodity. We need to eat to survive. And there's a diversity. We're omnivores, so there's a diversity of animal and plant forms that service food. Most organisms we grow and produce or process and consume as foods naturally allow adaptations, with one exception, to avoid being eaten. That's why plants taste bitter. And we've witnessed in the past hundreds of years really some big technological advances in the production and safety and sustainability. It still remains one of the most pervasive environmental pressures on health. And as Jasmine said, it also is an identifying feature of who we are. It identifies the cultures from where we came or where we live, the communities in which we live. So this was, I don't know if many of you saw Daily Bread. This is not scientific, but it's perspective as an artist. And I think sometimes, as Lewis Thomas said, I think the artist may have the answers to it all. He took photographs of 25 children living around the world and really surrounded them in this photo of what they eat. And it's really an interesting, I wasn't able to capture all the photos, but even look at girls versus boys in a particular culture, or within a culture, the different types of food. But it really illustrates multiculturalism, and as you'll see, also the impact of globalization on what we eat. We could look at Brazil, India, Senegal, Germany, United Arab Emirates, Italy, USA. And so you see all these different foods, some common, some not, but what children eating are in a day, identify who they are from those from outside the group. But there's commonalities as well with the globalization of the food environment. So what I want to do today is really talk to you as the senses that identify a food, our chemical senses, as really a biological signal. And I want to take this evolutionary approach and the perception of the signal and how that changes with age. And also, as I look back and try to think about the types of basic research from the beginning, is that you have certain principles, whether it's timing, sensitive periods, plasticity, redundancy, context, safety, and then also a generalizability. How do we learn? So the first part is really we are limited, for those of us who speak English, in identifying what taste is. Taste, it's three senses combined. It's your sense of taste, and taste really doesn't do justice because you have 5 basic tastes and probably a lot more, but it's also smells, and it's also irritants, the hotness of chili peppers, the coolness of mint. These all converge in the oral cavity and send signals to the brain with what something tastes like. Smell plays a much bigger role in identifying what foods are, and I think these senses, which have really been orphan senses, have gotten a lot of attention because of COVID. And they have always, especially the loss of smell, has signaled viral infections, can often precedes Alzheimer's and other neurological disorders, but they're all of a sudden giving, because of the pervasiveness of as a signal for some, they're, I think, getting a little bit more attention. So when we think of these senses that combine to send signals to the brain about what a food is, we have these basic taste, and it's really central to identifying food. Sweet is our signal for the first food that we were designed to feed, and that's mother's milk, but it's also a signal for calories. Sweet is a signal for carbohydrates. Salt is a needed mineral. Bitter can signal poison. Umami is a signal for protein. The taste of glutamate or sour maybe indicate ripeness. Not a lot of research on sour, but probably even more so, it's these volatiles that are perceived retronasally. You know, foods don't taste the same when you have a cold. There's nothing wrong with your taste receptors, as your olfactory receptors are blocked. Plug your nose when you eat, and that's what it's your sense of smell that enables you to distinguish cherry from strawberry jello, for example. And then there's these chemically induced sensations that are generated by the trigeminal nerve, and they all interact, and they interact with each other, as well as there's taste interactions. But these are our signals. This is what tells us about a food. This is what's learned, and that is what's modified with development and also with age. And so this is just an illustration. We typically think of smelling this way when these volatiles, these chemical volatiles, enter the nasal cavity and hit the olfactory receptors and high in the nasal cleft. But you also smell when foods are in the mouth and they reach the olfactory receptors that way. And so these senses are changed during development. And so I think one of the themes is that how children are living in their own different sensory world. And so how I just wanted to review some of that basic science. So these at least taste and olfactory systems are pretty well developed, probably by the second, third trimester. The fetus is swallowing about a liter of amniotic fluid a day near term. These olfactory and taste receptors are bathed in amniotic fluid, and they're capable of signaling information that biases behavior after birth. There's evidence of biological functioning, but also plasticity, and these changes, senses change with age. Children prefer much higher levels of salt and sweet, and then you see the adult pattern emerging as a group during late adolescence. We have some evidence that some children, depending on genotype, may have a heightened sensitivity for some bitters. That also changes during mid-adolescence. But we often think of taste in the oral cavity. Probably one of the biggest discoveries in the past 10 years is that especially these G protein coupled receptors, aren't just in the oral cavity, they're throughout the body sending signals. Bitter receptors are in your nose fighting viral infections or bacterial infections. So they're also gatekeepers and warning the GI system of incoming nutrients. Some of the earliest work looked at the newborn's response to basic taste. And today I'm going to talk a little bit more about sweet, just for time, and a little bit about bitter. But there's certain take-home messages for each. So when you place, within hours after birth, you can place a few drops of a sucrose solution on the infant's tongue, and you will get a facial relaxation and a smiling response. Sour, you'll see this puckering. Bitter, you'll see gaping. Salty taste, the ability to detect salty taste and respond to it emerges postnatally at around 4 months of age. Most of what we know is probably on sweet and salt, and there, again, it's a convergence of finding. You can do a 2-bottle preference test in an infant. They will ingest more of a sweet solution to water. This is the sketches of the sucking response. The top two are a term infant, and you can see for the sucking pattern in B, that's to the sweetened pacifier. You can see the stronger sucks, and the strength of the suck is increased. C and D is the preterm infant, and although their suck is much weaker, you can see the ability to detect sweetness and behaviorally respond to it is present at birth. And in this case, it's present in a 25 to 36-week-old gestational aged infant. And then you've got these facial expressions that are pretty phylogenetically well conserved. Children, when they get older, you could actually measure what's the level of sweetness you most prefer. And whether it's a nutritive or a low-calorie sweetener, you actually see that they're preferring higher levels of sweetness than the adult does. And if you equated all these for sweetness, it comes to be about it's not the higher the better. There actually is a certain level that they come to prefer. And then this changeover happens during mid-adolescence. These are the flags of the countries that have done basic research in sweet taste in children. Children of these countries prefer higher levels of sweet than adults. To graphically depict this is an 8-ounce glass of water. If you wanted to look at the bliss point of sweetness for the adult, you would add about 7 cubes of sugar into a glass of water. That's your level of sweetness of your average carbonated beverage. I mean, anybody that does a sensory panel, that's the level of sweetness adults like. Kids go high. It's about 12 cubes. It's sweet. And if you would taste the level of salt they like, that's pretty high too. So it's not that they're less sensitive to the sweetness. There's something, and there hasn't been a lot of animal model work, but there's been one study that shows also a switchover that happens during adolescence. It seems to be related to growth. You could look at the levels of some biomarkers for bone growth. And so you'll actually see children that are growing having a higher preference for sweet. So remember, this is our taste signal that is really a biological signal to attract children to energy during periods of growth. It makes perfect sense. We didn't evolve in an environment of low-calorie sweeteners or refined sugars. Children were attracted to carbohydrate, attracted to the first food, which was mother's milk, but also then to sources of energy, which most likely were fruit. Now, in contrast, you can see that bitter taste is actually, you'll see this gaping response, a decrease in sucking. And when you think of the big picture of it, this rejection is protecting us from ingesting things that could be toxic, but it's protecting the plant who's producing these chemicals from being eaten. And so, we all become food at one point. We eat and we become food. And so what you see is that children have this heightened sensitivity during childhood, whether that's to protect them, but there's individual differences. And so often, I don't know if, there actually was a time in which Bitrex, which is a very bitter agent, was put into all detergents and paints to try to deter poisoning for children, also to deter suicides in adults. And now the child-proof caps are used because of individual differences. Not all children are sensitive to that level of bitterness, so it doesn't work for all. Of all the taste qualities, you and your neighbor may be really living in different sensory worlds. Where sweet taste is the result of a dimer of 2 G protein coupled receptors. Last count, we've got 25, 30 bitter receptors, and sensitivity to one bitter doesn't necessarily predict sensitivity to another. It's important for us to detect that which could do harm and to avoid it. And so it really, even from looking at from the biological perspective of it, why do we like certain foods more than we like others? And that sensitivity is going to change with age, and it's also going to be related to individual differences. Here are all the places in which taste receptors are found throughout the body, some being vigilant, bitter receptors being vigilant gatekeepers in the nasal cavity to protect against viruses and bacteria. There even been some work with COVID in looking at some of these bitter receptors and those who get COVID versus not. But it's throughout the whole body. One wonders what we would call taste if we first discovered these receptors there rather than the oral cavity. But you really see the communication between many functions of the body, and taste is the signal in which we learn about foods. That's the signal that gets coupled with memory, that gets coupled with culture, that gets coupled with the satisfaction or a full belly. And so one of the other things that, when we think of today's, the first slide I showed you, the culprits are really salt and sweet and fat, is that when you think of the rules of cuisine, especially when it comes to sugars and salts, that they are doing much more than imparting of preferred tastes that our biology, that's a product of our biology. You may not like real high levels of sweet, but you typically will like a lower level. I mean, sweetness is a preferred taste by humans, but they do a lot more than that. They contribute to the functional property of food. They provide texture. They mask the bad taste. And I think that's one of the reasons why you often see such high levels of both salt and sweet in manufactured food and in children's medicines, but it's also part of the fermentation process as well. But it's a great bitter blocker, especially for children. And this one, again, this is the Nutcracker Man. And I really was intrigued when I read about him. And, we've evolved in very fluctuating and uncertain environments. And we really hit on an uncertain environment right now. But our primary challenge always was to obtain enough nutrients while avoiding that which produces harm or could be poisonous. And so in response to this challenge, this taste and smell and the irritation senses have really evolved to detect and prefer once was rare, which was salt and sweet, and to reject that which tastes bitter. Well, they looked at that dentition of the Nutcracker Man who's got very large molar teeth and thick, powerful jaws. And what they realized, and this was the caption of it, is he was eating fruit. And so you think of he may have had that adaptation, but if he had access to what he preferred, that's what he ate. And really sees, this is really part of our biology. So when you realize that children are living in this different sense world, or even your young teenagers, you realize that as the environment has changed, they have really become vulnerable because they have a biology that's very elegant to attracting them to energy during periods of growth. But they're now, many of us are living in environments where maybe those foods that are calorically poor, but inexpensive, but taste good to the child. And so this biology is, I think, pointing to why children are vulnerable to a food environment that's rich in sugars and low-calorie sweeteners and the challenges that parents face. But also, I don't think we can just say that the problem for children. Children are eating what adults are eating. And the adult diet is not great. And so I think it's really at the level of analysis of what is available, what foods are out there, what the family's eating. They've been doing this one survey for several years now. And regardless of as the years go on, taste always is the number one reason why people purchase and consume what they do. And so it can't be underestimated. You could put all your money in advertising. You could tell them about the health benefits of it, the convenience of it, but it's got to taste good. You could give children a prize in a box of cereal, but the mom's not going to buy the cereal again if the child doesn't eat it. And so taste really is a driver. And that's, I think, it's probably a little bit more, if I would compare taste and olfaction component of flavor, it's probably, quote unquote, a little bit more hardwired where you see these taste responses, but it's malleable as well. You learn. I mean, during childhood, you're learning how to eat, what to eat, who eats what time of day do you eat a food, but also how sweet or salty a food should taste. That's part of your cultural learning. And what's the appropriateness of a certain intensity of flavor. It often intrigues me how far can you go when that food no longer tastes like it should taste? We all grow up and our olfactory memories are our oldest memories. They take us to our past. They're going to long survive. Our food habits are going to long survive in language when we go into a new area or a new country. It's the food habits that persist. And it's all, this biology is probably explaining why. So I don't think we're ever going to be able to change the biology of a child to avoiding bitter and liking sweets, to get children to really prefer broccoli at the same intensity that they may prefer sweetness. But if this is the bad news, the good news comes that from basic research, applied research, that beginning very early in life, you learn to like what you eat. Our biology is not our destiny. And I actually think that was one of the points of confusion when a lot of the bitter receptor, super taster, non-super taster work emerged, is that people would find out that they could detect certain bitters, but they liked these foods as well. And I think one of the, and there are several other layers of stories about how our biology is not our destiny, but I think the earlier one learns, the more open or plastic the sensory systems are to learning. And so that gets into the next thing about the first way we learn about foods is through the flavors that are transmitted to amniotic fluid in mother's milk. We're learning about what mom is eating before we ever taste food. And so several years ago, the birth to 24, which then became the pregnancy and birth to 24 months began, and they did conducted some systematic reviews, and I've just kind of, instead of going into the details, highlight some of these systematic reviews that really provided the evidence base for some of the aspects of the new dietary guidelines, which was the first to give advice for what you should feed children, first time in U.S. history of what you should feed children under the age of 2. So when we were talking earlier with students, I was asked, why did you get into do the research that you did? And because I came from a biological background, I knew of research that had been done in other animals, but just hadn't been done in humans. And we knew, I think I spent most of my postdoc in the vet library, because in the 70s, there was tons of research, because the dairy industry was booming, about how cow milk would change based on what she ate and also what she breathed, that these volatiles, they would do work in which they would inject the volatiles into the lungs or into the udder of the cow, and they'd have sensory panel, and they would say that these off flavors developed. There was nothing off about these flavors. They were reflecting what she ate or what she preferred to eat. And since then, we and others have done research that a variety of flavors get transmitted to mothers from what mothers eat to these first foods. And this is an international area of research, whether it's garlic, alcohol, smoking, tobacco really changes the flavor of milk. Again, it's not just what you eat, it's also what you inhale. That's why they control ventilation environments. But what intrigued me the most was this large animal model literature about how young animals learn about food. And they will be more accepting of foods that contain flavors that they experience prenatally or postnatally. And the European rabbit, when I read that study by Hudson and Distel, I really got hooked, because she's a mammal who really nurses the young for very short periods of time. She's got a milk that has tons of fat in it, and she's out foraging most of the time. So they tagged her diet with juniper berry during pregnancy. Another group was during lactation. And then they looked at when these young finally left the nest, they're burrowed and they're isolated. They were more likely to forage on juniper berry if their mother had juniper berry. And this has been part of wildlife biology and trying to instill new food habits in grazing animals. And so, there's plasticity, there seems to be a stability. You can look at salmon and even think of going to the natal area. That's all a part of this type of flavor imprinting from early experiences. And so I wanted to apply that to humans. Some of the earlier work looked at, this was a study that both France and in Ireland. In France, they looked at women who drank a lot of anise-flavored beverages, and within hours after birth, the baby would orient toward the anise odor if they were in that group. But in Pepper and Ireland had done the same with garlic. So you can see that these prenatal experiences are biasing the baby's response. This is the same paradigm that they use to look at that the mother the baby would prefer the body odors of the mother, kind of following from DeCasper's work of looking at the mother's recognition of the baby's recognition of the mother's voice. This was a two-way street. It's not only that the baby was learning about maternal odors, the mother was also learning about the unique odor of her infant. And so we did the European rabbit study in humans and randomized women to ingest carrot juice during either pregnancy or lactation. Looked at a variety of different phenotypes. The face often tells a lot of the story. And then when they were weaned in counterbalanced order, looked at their acceptance of carrot. And babies who had prenatal or postnatal experience, either an amniotic fluid or mother's milk, would respond more favorably. They made less negative faces and tended to eat more as well. So here you see this fundamental feature that may be of all mammals, is that you first learn about your environment, about the environment in which you're being born into, because you're at an advantage. You've been giving that information from your mother, and it makes sense that there's, in case the food, that it would be either or. And although there's been some with dogs that seems to be that it may be compounded if they have it both. But it makes sense that there would be redundancy in case the food source changes. You don't want to imprint like onto one food if it's not available. So they'll bias these responses to flavor. So one of the other things that often emerged, and I often, thinking of DeCasper's work or thinking of a lot of the sensitive period work, Hubel and Weasel, what was done with vision, thinking of sensitive periods and audition, looking at children that for loss of hearing or loss of visual stimulation, is that it appears to be some sensitive periods that can result in long-term damage, and these periods often occur very early in life. But there hadn't been a lot of work and the timing of this for flavor. And so we all know that, if you have abnormal visual experience during a sensitive period, it's not that the window closes for sure. It's not critical. It's usually sensitive, and that you'll get abnormal spatial, you'll get amblyopia for a lifetime. And so what often fascinates me, and even thinking of the Hubel and Weasel work or thinking of the sensitive period, is that then led to changes in clinical practice. Cataracts were never removed during the first week of life before then. They always delayed it after the identification of a sensitive period in visual development. That changed everything. One wonders what we think of most likely the higher the cognitive function, the more sensitive periods, the longer the sensitive period. What do we need to know about flavor and food acceptance that we don't know about? But most likely it may take on greater importance because this food is a basic biological commodity. There's tons of plasticity, but I'm sure that got evidence that when something happens may be more important than how often it happens. That's the sensitive period story. And so we recently did another trial in which we just focused on lactation and tried to manipulate the timing of when mothers ingested this variety of juices. And we got evidence but it could be compounded by other factors, that the first month seemed to had the biggest effect. But that's often compounded as mother breastfeed more often during the first month. So it has to be teased apart. But regardless of when it happened, babies, again, when they were feeding cereal, made less facial expressions at distaste if their mothers were one of the experimental groups. I've done other works that I won't be able to go looking at. I've got a model system to look at sensitive periods for the taste of these protein hydrolysate programs. These are all the experimental groups that I've done. The purple box will be the exposure month. And basically, we can see that there's something that's happening before 4 months of age, in which if there's no experience prior to that, it's hard to get the baby to be accepting of that food. So it really kind of speaks to timing effects, and that's obviously an area to try to further explore. But I often say, and I even said it this afternoon, it's easy. It's difficult to teach an old dog new trick. It's a lot easier to teach a young dog. And that's kind of the same principle of this plasticity of learning. And we were even talking about children and wearing masks. There's plasticity, which often surprises you of how well they can adapt to changes. And I think flavor is part of that story. But having a food in an environment doesn't ensure, again, this was another lesson, that the animal is going to eat it. And so basically, there's another big take-home message, is that we learn to like what we eat. And the repeated exposures, gradual introduction, building on the familiar is often a theme in a lot of the early feeding literature. That's also influenced by context and influenced by the individual that you'll learn about more later. But this was another systematic review that was done for the B24 project. So once the baby, regardless if they're breast or formula fed, are weaned to solid foods, 8 to 10 days, just tasting the food seems to do the trick. They'll be more accepting after the exposure than before the exposure. And they've used a lot of different fruits and vegetables. It's a very international body of research. And one of the things that I find fascinating, Leanne Birch had done this study, is that most of the research was done with commercial food. You want to control the stimuli, make sure the baby's tasting the same thing. But Leanne did a study that then looked at repeated exposure to a baby food. Did that increase acceptance to a homemade version of the food? And the answer was no, which makes perfectly sense. These foods differ in texture. It's to get the baby to the next point, to get the baby from weaning to the foods of the table is going to take learning about different textures. Going just from commercial to homemade, foods don't always taste the same. You've got seasonality of vegetables and fruits. And so that's part of the learning. And that's probably why variety works, is that it's not always tasting the same. Just as variety impacted education and learning about things in children, you see variety works also in learning about foods. So the function of the nervous system, if you really boil it down, is to store information and produce adaptive behaviors that reflect prior experience. And that is food. You learn to like what you eat. And looking at a food doesn't always work. And again, this was one of Leanne's work, is that it takes longer to teach the older child than it does the baby. So it's not that there's still that plasticity, but the baby is much more plastic and responsive to these changes as you grow. And then we all know that even though we know what we eat is the number one risk factor for many non-communicable diseases, it's really difficult to change the adult. And I think that's one of the reasons why birth to 24 months was so exciting, is that to start early. How do we start early so we can ensure that children are eating happy and, most importantly, enjoy the foods that we feed? That's really a part of feeding. And so how do we learn about foods? Obviously, I focused on these first two foods, but we learn through repeated exposure, with variety. We learn through peers. Oh, it's kind of get stuck. So let's see if we can go to the next one. Oh, children will learn. Sometimes I think with sweet, it's a one trial learning. So I think probably the new guidelines of not introducing added sugars to the age of 2 might actually be good, because I think once they taste it, it's hard to go back. We've got modeling that you're going to hear about. We've also got peer modeling. It's really all building on the familiar and a gradual exposure of how one learns. And then what happens when you don't have those experiences? What happens if you're deprived of these experiences? What's the consequences of that? So I think that this plasticity in developmental programming is really involved in to provide the best chances of survival and reproductive success to the organism when environments change. That's what that is. It's that all behaviors have ultimately that goal. And so for weaning to occur, one of the other big take-home lessons is that these developmental processes have to ensure that the young animal learns both what to eat, but also how to that has the motivation to forage. I mean, these senses really are the motivation, and it's all linked to where this information is sent. Sweet is man's oldest reward. It's sending information to all the reward pathways in the brain, as does salt. So these first foods are really primed by the diet, but food sources may change. And so what we're getting information about is that these are the foods that mom likes, or these are just the foods that she has access to, and these are the foods that are safe because she's eating them. So this redundancy has a lot of importance biologically. It's providing a lot of different complementary routes of transferring information that will be reinforced then when the child eats the foods of the table. Moms feed children what they eat. And so, our recent human history has experienced a time when mothers can feed foods that they don't eat. That's pretty recent and very rare, and isn't sustainable. They have to eventually get to the foods of the table. And so that's why this information is important. And that's why when you see how learning about foods begin, I don't think you can ever think about just feeding children without feeding a family, without feeding a mother. They're two ultimately linked. And that's really the beginning of learning. This is not unique to humans. This was really what gave me the information. Fred Provenza is a wildlife biologist and often says it's not innate, it's learned, and it's part of every animal's culture. And so when a food tradition is lost, let's say you want to have an animal graze on a grass that's not palatable, it's high in terpenes, what do? You feed the mother during pregnancy. That's how you reintroduce a habit. And so that, I can only hope that one day research in human flavor learning can get to the level that it has in other animals. That still inspires me into this complexity of learning. She's teaching the young not just, and as are other conspecifics. It's not just the mother that's playing this role then too, but she's teaching what plants to avoid, what plants to eat occasionally, what plants to eat together so that you could reduce the burden of a toxin, when plants are at peak nutritional content. It's a very, very complicated learning that really, when you think about it, food is our link to the environment. It is our environment, and we cannot underestimate that in thinking about how these food habits change, or what are we passing on. It's more than why we like a certain type of food. So why it's sustainable is that these senses that's what is the substrate upon which you learn, or you associate events with. You associate it with your family. You associate the taste of this type of food when you were growing up, or this is the food that you eat during holidays. It's not, it could be a little bit what the food looks like, but it's really what it tastes like. And so these senses are linking babies to mothers, but also to other conspecifics, and also the environment in which you're being raised. Moms are the first source of information, and there are cultural influences that I often find fascinating that dictates what women should eat during pregnancy or lactation. What she may be eating some of the more revered foods during these times to ensure that those preferences for those foods persist, because great importance is placed that the baby accepts these foods that one identifies as their own. And so you want the baby to enjoy that type of food, and they become part of the group when they eat that food. And we can't help as mothers and fathers feed children what they eat. So mothers are the first bridge to the environment. And this culture can get disconnected if you feed babies foods that their mothers aren't eating. And that's what's happened in modern time. Before, it was often that the food was just, you would mash it to decrease the textural component of it. But in most cultures, by the age of 2, children are eating what adults are eating. And so it's this gradual process that not only the chemical senses are learning from many different aspects of whether it's an intensity of chili peppers that maybe starts at around 2. Rosin's work, I think, said 2 years or older, but also the increased complexity of texture, how the food can change based on season and ripeness of food. But it's a very complex learning that when you eat that food, it not only identifies you as part of a family or a group, but identifies others to identify you as part of it. So it's from within, but it's also for how others see you, is the foods that you eat and enjoy. I often found that it was interesting that Hippocrates reasoned that breast milk was best suited because they had thought that at that time that breast milk was converted blood. And he thought it was from the same converted blood as was amniotic fluid. So it was a familiar source of nutrient. And that's what mother's milk is. It's a bridge to what was fed before to the foods of the table. And he also appreciated that nutrition and growth depend on what arrives from the mother into her womb. It was the same connection between plants and soil that preceded this. It's the link to the environment. So I always kind of resonated with those words. So I think sometimes through scientific inquiry, biology reveals its elegance and its simplicity and its fundamental principles. We have a biology that attracts us to certain types of flavors and taste during periods of growth. We have that in many mammals, and it may be not just a unifying feature of all mammals, I used to always say that, but also vertebrates. Recently, there has been work done in chickens to show that what the mother ate that flavored the yolk, that if that egg was fertilized, the hatchlings would first accept a novel food if it contained that familiar flavor. So maybe a common, a fundamental principle of all vertebrates is that mothers provide this sustainable information about what is a food source and what to expect to eat. Because again, food is a basic biological commodity. We have a reward system. We've got, it has its origins in early life, but these senses are really linked to that which provides pleasure, which provides comfort, which provides an identity. And these all have its roots in childhood, and it all links us to our individual past. So I just wanted to thank you again. I couldn't have done this alone. These are just some of my colleagues that I've been working with over the years. But thank you for allowing me to present this to you today, and it's truly been an honor. Thank you.
All right, folks have questions and want to come up to start asking them?
It's so weird to talk to people. I forgot how much I missed it. I knew I missed it. You need to get here. Just gonna stop sharing real quick. Take a break.
Anybody in the room want to come ask your question? And then in the meantime, if you are on Zoom, I will, you want to raise your hand and I will call on you next.
So in terms of like our other perceptual system, you see kind of like a perceptual narrowing occurring where like you can discriminate between a bunch of different precepts, and that like the amount of precepts you can discriminate between becomes narrower, but then get this like efficiency trade-off. Is there anything like that happens like in the domain of taste? Like we taste a more variety of things, then there's some sort of like categorization or narrowing happen? I don't know if you can both taste that. Just curious.
Yeah, to me, it's really kind of fascinating. You know, think of when you first left home, or if you're like when I was growing up, I would never be able to eat in an Italian restaurant. It didn't match how different does it have to be to match? So if there's that type of perception, how do you identify what a fruit is, especially things that have more volatiles and more flavors or spices? When is it too much, too little? And why does variety work? What does the baby learn? I mean, yeah, some of these fruits may share common volatiles, a lot of aldehydes, but why does a variety of vegetables increase the acceptance of fruit? Is it the expectation that something different? Is it just, that there was a lot of early learning work or education work about the effects of a variety of teaching methods and how that would work. So I don't have the answer to it, but it's often really intrigued me. Often when you look at these, children will cue in on sweetness. Sometimes I think when it's a complex food, I do a lot of work with medicines as well, that the sweetness of it will drive, whereas maybe the adult is perceiving something else. But when you add the sugar, there's something about it that they tune into. It may be more salient for them, but they can learn through that food and can learn through the other qualities. So what is it? And I don't have the answer, but I think taste and smell have provided a challenge in how to control the stimuli in presenting it, to do those elegant types of experiments. But it's a great question, and I think it's really operating at a level of even how does one identify a food as a food? You get to a certain point and it's no longer edible, or it's no longer pleasurable. It's not the same type of food. Obviously that has to do with your individual history and also your evolutionary history, how sensitive you are, but how you've learned about how a food should taste like is part of who from your beginning. Good question. Don't have the answer.
Okay, let's try a question from Zoom. I see a question from Kathleen Maloney. So I am just going to, before you ask your question, I'm going to unmute this computer. Okay.
Oh, nice.
Okay, I think I'm ready for you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
All right. As someone who studies anhedonia and depression, there's a loss of the decrease in interest in pleasure or whole things. And I'm interested to know if there's anything that either you know or you know research is being done about mothers with depression during pregnancy, and whether that influences their food intake, their food spectrum, their nutritional spectrum, and things like that.
It's a great question, and there may be research out there, but I'm just not aware of it. But there is links to one area of research that I didn't talk about, and it's especially salient for children, is that the more depressed you'll see eating more of sweets, or the higher the most preferred level of sweetness, whether that's linked to dopamine levels, and that's obviously one hypothesis for that. But I don't know if, obviously mothers are going to, and I think there's some evidence for this, I think even Julie Lumig, is that children learn the context, and they'll learn why mothers eat what foods when they do. And so for example, my own work looking at how children learn about alcohol is that you can look at women who drink to escape feeling. There's a scale that you can look for escaping emotion or whatever, and you can see that children whose mothers drink for that reason, when they are asked if they like an odor or not, the same with tobacco, will respond differentially. So they're learning the context in which their parents feed, and we know that usually sweet intake goes up with depression. Often you see the ingestion of more sweet things as a way to, so I would imagine that that's one thing that you learn, but I don't know of the research, but there's always been that link. I mean, sweet taste is man's oldest reward. It's being co-opted by many drugs of abuse. And so that is, and whenever I would give a talk about the biology of sweet taste, and there would be an audience of those that work with those that are suffering from addiction, even if you look at living sober, the first thing that they'll allow during early periods of abstinence is a hard candy. And then they'll say how they gradually will reduce that. But it's sweet taste has often been claimed that will allay the urge to drink. But it's not that sugar is using the pathways for alcohol or drugs of abuse or opiates. The opiates are using the pathways for sweet. That's why they're often linked. So sorry, if I find something, I'll give them to Julie, and I'll try to do that. Sorry, I didn't have the right answer. I think Julie did some stuff too, didn't she? Julie Lomé, with something with depression with moms.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'll look. If I find it, I'll give it to you.
Okay, let's take a question from here in the house.
Hello, first of all, thanks for coming. Thank you for that with this event. I'm also just as a parent who did Halloween coming out.
Yeah.
Last year, Halloween for about 11 months. People like Halloween. So I have one story and then a question. The story is much more for food. I started 20 years ago, and Tony the Castor was the first head. And at the first week of the semester was at a apartment party. So Tony saw me. He was such a neat person. He really kind of warmly remembered here.
Beautiful shirt.
Yeah, he was such a neat guy, and I got a lot of good advice from him. But in this first week of being hired, moving down, he's like, "Hey, Paul, you got a car?" I was like, "Of course I have a car." Why don't you come with me to the grocery store here at Peter? I need to pick up the kid. And it did not seem strange at the time to go, "Okay, Paul, the department head." But we did get there, Peter, and got all these bags of beer for the department party, dragged them to this house, and we were saying it must be had this strange, like old timey grinder. And I was like, "What was that?" He said, "Oh, well," he said, "you don't have kids." And he said, when he fed his kids, he said, "Don't buy baby food, don't buy baby food. Take them on the plate, you grind it up in the grinder, and give it to them. Whatever you're eating, even if it sounds weird, a hamburger, just put it in there and grind it. Just grind it. And then make a plan to salt it, just grind it, because none of my kids are picky." And so I was reminded of that during the talk, and I wish I could remember that when my kids were eating. I didn't do that. But my question was, I have to say, I had no idea about taste receptors in the body. I understood your figure right, like bitterness receptors in the skin. Mine was sort of blown. I was trying to just say a little bit more about sort of taste receptors within the body, but also sort of on the surface. Really very deep.
Yeah, it's probably also, sending information about the digestion of food or endocrine producing cells often help probably aiding in digestion. There's research that's going on at Penn looking at the bitter receptors in the nose. Those that suffer from chronic sinusitis are often bitter and sensitive. And so they were genotyping individuals who had recurrent, realizing that these bitter receptors are probably killing bacteria or viruses in the nasal cavity, having that vigilant role that bitter taste also has in the oral cavity of don't ingest. So yeah, it's a fascinating area of research, from everything from the lungs to, and again, I think that it's kind of taken on greater importance, realizing the sentinel role that these senses play now during this pandemic, and how the loss often, precedes the insult. So we're just only now starting to learn. A lot has been focusing on the digestive component of it, but many, many other roles probably as well. And with the theme of vigilant gatekeeper, I think that's what a lot of those bitter receptors are doing. Yeah, it's really exciting.
Hi, this might be a naive question. I was just wondering about, because a lot of the research is with like breast milk, and development taste and looking at that. Are there differences with like formula feeding versus breastfeeding and how that affects like taste development? Or is it like, do they have formula that mimics the same type of taste? Or, yeah, are there differences?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that, just from an experimental point of view, you can't randomize to breastfeed. I mean, there have been creative ways to try to randomize to breastfeeding interventions. But I think the issue is that for breast milk, every baby's their own group. Every baby's going to have a unique experience like they had prenatally. But even amongst formulas, one formula doesn't taste like the other. So you can look at early taste experience. Breastfed human milk is very high in glutamate, for example. So you can see this liking of protein taste, umami taste. You can look at the different flavors of formulas, and the baby will behave differently. But it's plastic. And so just like the repeated exposure, once they go to solid food, when you're doing some of these short-term preference tests, what they're eating will dictate how much sweet they like or how much salt they like. So it's this plasticity, how long, what happens when you reactivate a memory with the food, how long can you go without not being exposed to them? So you eat these jarred foods or eat the formula. How do you have a preference for that? We've looked at, like, especially with different types of formula, we can look at toddlers and still will get more of a preference for bitter or sour in those children who are fed one type of formula versus another. With mother's milk, I think it's going to be these volatiles. So it's not breastfed versus those, although you'll see big group differences, but they may be different for a variety of other reasons, who breastfeeds, who doesn't. But I think every breastfed baby is their own group. They're so unique. It changes. The flavor experience are changing throughout the course of feed. The fat content's more than doubling. The volatiles of what she eats is going to get into the milk, and what she eats may differ from morning to night, from day to day. So it's very varied, and that may be the key thing of it's a varied experience, unlike formula that doesn't change.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mennella.
Oh,
I love your talk. I had forgotten, well, I think I always knew that babies have this preference for sweet tastes, but I was so surprised by how much bigger it is than what adults like. So I have a two-part question related to that. One is, can you just say a little bit more? I think you mentioned that the switches kind of shuts off in adolescence. Can you talk a little bit about the adaptive purpose of the timing of that? And then my second question is, changes in our diet, the fact that our diet has gotten more and more unhealthy with greater exposure to high fat and high sugar food, has that changed the timing of that? Or could you speculate if that evidence doesn't exist right now? Do you think it can change the average timing of that shift?
So I think the timing changes if puberty happens earlier, and that's what we're kind of seeing. Puberty happening early, you'll get the shift happening early. Now, this is a biology that's overlaid with the importance of, and I think these senses the brain places great importance on what you're eating and what is food. And so I think the fact that these senses are very rewarding, and just the way where they send messages to the brain, whether it's sweet or salt or fat, is that the learning's quick and rapid. So I think delaying probably could benefit, because I think once children experience sweet, it's hard to get back to it, but you raise an important question about the changing food environment, and that now with low-calorie sweeteners, foods that weren't sweet are now sweet. Toothpaste is sweet. And so you should expect a cultural cohort of, yes, you'll still get that age-related decline, but it's context learning. So you learn what a food should taste like, and that may shift, but if all you know is yogurt, and this is some of Leanne's work too, if all you've ever experienced is sweetened yogurt, that's what you're going to prefer, regardless if you're a child or not. And so, when they'll look at markets and look for yogurt, and some European countries will prefer non-sweetened yogurt, but that's what they're fed from an early age. If you always feed sweetened, that's what identifies what a yogurt is. You learn how sweet a food should taste like. So you're learning the context of taste in what you experience. So yes, you'll be the shift. There's individual differences. Those that have more, those that have family history of alcoholism are going to have a higher bliss point for sweet that may not change with age. Those that, for those that smoke, cigarettes, you'll see with tobacco addiction, you'll also see the elevated sweet preferences, especially during the early periods of abstinence. So there's that seesaw effect that has this biology that'll decline based on habits or age. But what we learn about foods is context specific. Do you identify it as one? So, do you like the brick cookies like Italians do that don't have a lot of sugar versus another one? That's what you learn. That's what you like. So there hasn't been a lot of animal model research. So I think that's the other reason why some of this work, because it needs a good, why do we get the change? Why is it mid-adolescence? And what happens? Is it simply, looking at dopamine changes in the brain? What's really often fascinated me is in the baby, you can give sweet taste and it blunts expressions of pain for like crying. It'll work in the child. It won't work as well for the person that asked about depression, which may be a signal that there's some differences in pathways of sweet. It's not that they don't like the sweet, but it's just not as good as attenuating the pain. And then it doesn't work in the adult. So there's something about the power of the sweet signal that changes, but we don't know what it is. I think it's real. So when you have this abundance of sweet, kids are really going to learn. They're learning the context of it, and they learn what they like, and you're going to have something that's very pleasurable, and then all of a sudden at 8 or 9 you're introducing a vegetable. It's going to be tough.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. If anyone else on Zoom wants to raise your hand and ask a question, if there's anyone else in the audience who has a question.
Thank you. First of all, okay, thank you. First of all, reactions to that, it's really fascinating to me that when parents use alcohol, their kids might like more than that.
There's a lot of research in that one.
Yeah. I was thinking about seasonality. That's something that's been true for humans all the time. The food changes across the seasons. And I was wondering if there's, and it's true for animals too, I was wondering if there was any research on food preferences based on what season the baby was in. And it's probably the same answer like context.
It's a great question. I get a lot of anecdotes from mothers. I was pregnant during the summer with this child and in the winter months with that. And so I hear it a lot. I don't know of any studies, but obviously if there is seasonality and it differs on what you eat, it's, that redundancy, if you will, is that the child's getting information about what mom is eating, and that changes based on season. So I've heard that a lot. I've heard of mothers who adopt to try to find out about where their baby came from. If it's from a certain country, try to adopt those food habits to try to provide that comfort and link. So I hear a lot of those stories, but I don't know of research that, although in the big picture, we can look at food habits around the world, and it's what identifies a group from another group is the foods that we eat. And so you have that basic principle there about what it defines, foods define who we are. And, and you could have, one culture that considers this plant a food where another will never have even been exposed to it. So the culture provides the experiences around which this biology works and learns, is the way I think about it.
I think I saw another hand from Kathleen, so if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to unmute this computer. And then
Are you able to hear me?
yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, good.
Hey, hi.
I've had the benefit of recently spending a lot of time with a toddler, but I noticed that even though she has very diverse food set, her mother lots of food in New York City, they just eat, really, really a lot of very authentic food. She loves to eat the same food, but deconstructed.
Huh.
And I'm wondering if there's something about that. Like, she'll have all the components of a burrito, but she wants them each as their individual part, something like that. And if there's something to that about experiencing different flavors. And the reason I'm asking too, I'm a super taster, so I know super tasting is a genetic factor, and I've been sort of curious about food. My family also has these, abilities, learning about bitters and how some people actually enjoy them and can eat them. And I'm wondering if that's the case in my family, where I don't know how that deconstructing food and food.
When I think of deconstructing food, I think of texture. She doesn't want to eat the texture. It's really experiencing textures by themselves. That's what I think of when I think of deconstructing a food, what the child is doing. But I may be wrong. Your biology is not your destiny. You can learn to like foods and be real sensitive to them. And I think witness cultures around the world on what is a food. And that tells you that we all share that biology. And so it's where we differ is our experiences. But when I see the child doing that, it's almost like a flavor perspective of when they don't want the food to touch. They experience it one at a time. That's how I see it. And it could be even taste, some may, but I think texture is big. And that really is unexplored. There's some research, but not as much as there should be. I think the experimental question's been a difficult one, especially with babies, because it could affect chewing and, a whole host of things about trying to think of what the experimental stimuli, but they have done work with different textures of applesauce and things like that. But with the child, and I would imagine that that child has been allowed to do that for a long time. That's the other thing I would predict. They've been able to deconstruct their food. And so they haven't persisted. That's just what I think.
Can you turn the video on, please?
Once again, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the talk.
Well, thank you.
I was wondering if any of the processes or results that you talked about kind of work in the opposite direction, in particular with like food aversions. And I was just kind of thinking, anecdotally, there are foods I have bad experiences with that I eventually could eat, and then there are ones that I still cannot eat to this day. So I was wondering if there was anything that could explain like why those either continue or don't continue, either with the sensitive periods or modeling or anything like that.
Well, even being linked to radiation, you don't want to eat a food that you enjoy. I mean, that's even advice that is given now because it could result in aversions. I would imagine the intensity of the aversive event, how sick you got, could often result in lifelong. But there are, why do certain foods, you may not even have memories of when that event happened, when you were sick or you got And then you reverted to the last food that you ate, which is usually what immediately preceded it. That's why the advice will be, don't eat those foods that you really enjoy right before you're having chemo or radiation therapy. So it's real. Why their time course could be different for one versus the other, I would imagine would have to do with some, not only the intensity of it, but also some of the timing. So that's why windows don't close. You just kind of see it like, yeah. But that's really important in trying to think of improving quality of life when things like that happen, when food's no longer, for those suffering from COVID where everything tastes like gasoline. I mean, these are real issues about things that we take for granted to sustain, and realize the importance it is to eat. And the pathways that are there to encourage eating, maybe to the fault that we've kind of, swayed to the other side of it and suffer the consequences of obesity or overeating. What we tend to think of for those that don't have food, or those that, but also with sickness. Yeah, it's real. It's real. Great question.
Well, I have, I'm gonna steal the last question for myself. I have one quick question that, well, we'll see if it's quick or not. So you talked about repeated exposure, and kind of 8 to 10 days or 8 to 10 exposure seems to be coming up a lot in the literature. But then when you look at, say, focus groups of parents about, how long they will persist offering the food their child doesn't seem to want to eat, you'll see a lot of a big range, most 3 to 5, but then some parents will keep persisting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the barriers to actually executing repeated exposure as a strategy for getting your kids to like a food.
That's a great question. I think it was a woman at Harvard that recently did her thesis on that. And so look at 8 to 10 days, just tasting it is what these studies have done. That's a lot of wastage of food if you're not eating the food. And so I think that gets at the heart of you can't feed children separately than adults. Because if it was like what DeCasper did, and you wanted the child to be exposed to Brussels sprouts and you just mashed it up and put it in your puree, you would eat what the child didn't eat, or the remainder of it, or you wouldn't puree as much of it. For the mother that's not eating those foods, but feeding the jarred food, that's waste. And and that's what the Harvard study said, she could spend that money to buy something that's palatable. A pint of blueberries could cost $5. They could buy something that she knows the child likes, she knows the child enjoys, and it's not going to be waste. So that's the issue, is when you get the disconnect of what you should feed a child, and you're not focusing on her and what she should be eating, and it's really a family that eats. Otherwise, it's waste. So that's what I think about that. It's really a luxury to give 8 to 10 days of a tasting, because you're throwing out the rest. I agree. That's a great question.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all the time we have for right now. Everyone enjoy coffee and tea and snacks out in the pre-function room. And I'm going to get everything set up in here for the next talk, but please be back at 3:15.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was wonderful. Great questions. I thank the people. That was a good one. Yeah, that one I really. Did you see that thesis?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, she called.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing, if anyone has a pair of wired headphones that I could borrow for the second talk, that would be useful. Right. Yeah, for some reason, I don't know. I tried to put the volume on the iPads all the way down, but it would only go so far. I guess it thinks that why would you do that when you're on Zoom?
Was it?
There was still a little bit of sound coming out, so we fixed it on one side of the phone. And then
Should be like the thing on the side should do it. Like when you put it in silent mode, like
I'm gonna try and see.
Yeah, I tried to put it.
That's exactly it.
I tried to put it. Let me do that. There's like a very precise order of operations.
do you want me to turn the big screen off?
Because you have to, make that for the Zoom.
Yeah. This is, yeah, I don't know why it didn't look like this when Julie was talking. Like it should have. It worked like this when I was talking.
It had more
Yeah.
stuff on it. Right now, this looks great.
Yeah.
How's it gonna look on the Zoom? Is
On the
different.
Zoom.
Yeah. Let me go down. I can take a look on the iPad.
And then I can shift these boundaries. Should I shift them now? What if I,
I just see.
so what if I shifted the size of it? Would that make a difference?
What do you want? Let me
Like I was gonna move this over and make this bigger.
yeah, let me move this over first.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Maybe.
Do this first.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thanks.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks.
The 8 to 10.
Yeah, text me.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
Thanks.
I think they
And I can
cue
raise
it
it.
as a
Yeah,
Facebook.
I raise that.
So they stop.
Like this, is
Make
that
it
this?
bigger.
Yeah. Oh,
Well, you know, it's a taste. Is different.
Oh, not that.
is that
Then I
good?
have to scroll down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's what it looks like on Zoom.
Great.
Yeah, I think there's like a very precise order of operations that needs to happen for it to look like this. And so.
I looked at,
Great. You're the tech person.
Yes, I am.
So you'll make sure that they never see this part, right? Like you'll shut it down as soon as it comes out.
Yeah.
You'll turn it off. I don't like to give away my
I
tricks.
know, I felt that way when I was teaching the fall. Every step.
3:15, right?
Yeah, I'm not gonna turn this microphone on until you're ready to start. I think that's
Okay.
fine with me.
I forgot what it's like to talk where I could see someone. I know this is, look at how long.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll show you. Where is it at? Yeah, I know.
Is it this one that would turn all the way down?
Both of them.
So, had a pair of wires that we can plug in. And of course, it's like the one thing that I said, why would I do that? Well, it's actually I know, I don't get it. Okay. We took them out when someone was asking a question. So that was okay.
It doesn't take that long. And then as long as
Oh, okay. 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 Right.
Oh, but this is the, yeah. It's like
Okay, I'm ready. Like I know that we practiced this part, and it just maybe in like a natural. Why you want Of course, why would you want to like be in a Zoom and not hear what is being said? I will be here at 8:30. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the talks are at 9, so there's gonna be a little bit of setup. I think we have a better sense of what to do. I'm gonna after break. I will. No, I don't. Okay. You want me to show you when we get back? I think so. I don't think I do. Just like a meal. I was worried about that.
You enjoying it so far? It's actually fun. Find things going with your applications. What's the kind of expectation, I guess? Yeah, kind of like this first you think you might need that expo? So it's this.
So originally we were going to do right, we're going to do 4, and then you're going to have 4 together, join on, and then 1, and then you'll see then you push it. Can I just listen? It's just so complex. It is complex. Okay, you want to try the more? It's join on. Wi-Fi, and then you can use. So this is music. This is music right now. So then you would have. Okay, so do it again. Disconnect audio. Yeah. Wi-Fi.
Oh, this.
Yeah.
Cause I can, oh, yeah.
Yep. This should work.
What am I pushing?
Just this one, the very worn down button from years of me using that finger.
Right.
Just one thing real quick. Okay, Armin, so you're gonna pass it down. So you ready for me to?
Yeah, I think we'll be getting ready to start in just a minute. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think we're just about ready to get started for our second talk of the afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed coffee and snacks. I'm so thrilled next to welcome Cynthia Stifter. After I invited Dr. Stifter to attend, I learned that she has many UNCG connections. So to introduce her and give a little bit of a more personal introduction, I'd like to invite Dr. Esther Lurkes from our Department of Human Development and Family Studies to introduce Dr. Stifter.
Thanks, Jasmine, for organizing such a great event and for giving me this honor. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our next speaker to you, Dr. Cynthia Stifter. Dr. Stifter received her PhD from the University of Maryland, where she worked with the eminent scholar, Dr. Nathan Fox. Since that time, she's gone on to have an amazing research career at Penn State University. Her expertise is in temperament and its impact on behavioral health and physical health. She recently extended her focus to also include the impact of temperament and regulation on children's early weight outcomes. She's authored many publications on infant, toddler, and preschool development, including the emergence of self-regulation, the effect of emotion regulation on behavioral control, the psychobiology of temperament, and the role of temperament in parenting and child behaviors. These publications have appeared in many top-tier journals, including Child Development, Developmental Psychology, the International Journal of Obesity, and Pediatrics. She also has an extensive history of NIH funding, most recently taking the leap from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to the National Institute, I always get this one wrong, the National Institute for Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Disease because of her more recent focus on obesity research. She's also an American Psychological Sciences Fellow, has served on several NIH panels, and was an associate editor of the journal Child Development, one of the premier journals in our field. In addition, Cindy has mentored many scholars who have gone on to have very productive research careers of their own. On a personal note, I'd like to say that I've known Cindy since I was a graduate student. I first reached out to her because I wanted to adapt a coding scheme she had created for infant affect, and I'm still using that coding scheme all these years later, and it's been very effective, so thank you for that. Since that time, Cindy has been a very gracious colleague and someone who I've viewed as an additional mentor. In fact, I often like to tell people that Cindy has adopted me. After my mentor retired from academia and most of my peers from graduate school moved on to clinical work, I found myself very alone at national and international conferences, and Cindy and all of her students adopted me and invited me to all of their lab dinners, which has just been such a wonderful opportunity for me that I've appreciated. I also have to say that she has the tradition of buying the first round of beer for all of her mentees, and I've been mooching off that for a very long time. So to say I owe her one is an absolute understatement. So I'm so thrilled that she's here today. And the title of her talk is What the Child Brings to the Table, the Role of Temperament in Parent Feeding, Child Eating, and Child Weight Status. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stifter to UNCG.
Yes, I knew Esther when she was just a child. And look how she's grown. It seems like it's when students, well, you weren't a student of mine, but when I see graduate students move on and do great work, I'm so happy about it. So thank you. It was a pleasure to have you introduce me. So I should start by saying it is an honor. Thank you, Jasmine, for inviting me to talk about my research as part of the Kendon Smith lecture series. I want to thank you too, Jasmine, for organizing such a great group of presentations, and I'm looking forward to hearing tomorrow's talks as well. Julie's was great. So as you can see by the title, I'll be talking about how child characteristics, specifically temperament, has a role in how parents feed their children, how children eat, and the probability that they will be overweight or obese. Now, identifying early developmental factors related to the risk for childhood obesity is crucial towards preventing the cascade that we're now seeing from adolescent to adult obesity. Okay. Do I have to? No, it's not working. I can always use those. So there it goes. It's there. Okay. All right.
It takes a few tries.
Well, you know it's going to stop as soon as you walk away. Now, several models have proposed that children's characteristics, including temperament, contribute to their own development through their influence on the context in which they develop. Here we go. No, that went backwards. I swear to God. Here we go. One more time. Maybe I should. All right. Maybe it's me.
Yeah,
Well,
it's this button.
You should stand there and click the button.
It's this button that is worn off from you, so it doesn't have an arrow anymore. That's the forward button.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Oh, I
This
was
one.
pressing the back.
That one.
There you go.
There you go.
You learn something every day, even at my age. Okay. So Bronfenbrenner's, everyone knows about Bronfenbrenner, is an ecological model and Lerner's relational meta-model of developmental systems theories, a lot of words there, for example, place individual differences is central to this relationship. Now, while these models are rightly complex, one of the earliest and enduring of the bidirectional relationships is that between the child and his or her caregiver. This transaction is dynamic, such that the child's responses to the parent in turn affects how the parent reacts and so on. So as you know, some of these interactions can be very short and some can go on for some length of time. For example, when an infant cries, the parents, hopefully, will respond with soothing techniques to try to reduce the distress. The infant is then open to the ministrations and becomes less distressed. The parent then may go on to introduce a new soothing technique, such as distraction, to continue to further return the infant down to a calm state. Now, once calm, the parent and the infant then may turn to a new interaction around a new goal. Let me do this. So while each partner's reactions occur over the duration of the interaction, it's when the transaction recurs over days, weeks, or months, as well as across situations, that these patterns may form the foundation for developmental outcomes. For example, research has shown persuasively that responsive parenting, for example, that responds appropriately and sensitively to individual differences leads to positive outcomes. One of the first and thus foundational interactions is that of parent-infant feeding interaction, not only because it provides nutrients, but also because it delivers warmth and feelings of safety, which are crucial to several developmental outcomes. It is also an intimate method for the parent to learn about the child's dispositional reactions. In other words, the infant's reactions during the feeding interaction likely contributes to the formation of the parent's impression of who the child is becoming. Now, quite obviously, parents are essential to the young child's nutrition. They provide food, they determine when, how much, and where the food is being delivered, and hopefully they respond appropriately to the child's hunger and satiety cues. Now, one important task for caregivers is the introduction of new foods, as it's essential for the children's nutrition to be exposed to a variety of, let me go back. They introduce new foods typically around 6 months of age when kids are starting on solids, and new foods continue to be introduced throughout childhood. Now, accepting new foods is a developmental task for the child because it's essential for their nutrition to be exposed to a variety of foods. So the child is contributing by accepting or not accepting the foods. So this feeding interaction is a dynamic one. It follows, if it is, and it is, it follows that the infant's reactions to new foods and the feeding process may be influenced by their temperament. Past research in childhood obesity has focused on physical characteristics such as age or birth weight in terms of predicting outcomes. But more recently, researchers have been considering how the child reacts in this feeding interaction, specifically through their temperament. So before talking about some data on the acceptance of new foods, I just want to do a little primer for those of you who are not familiar with temperament, but I'm sure most of you are. So bear with me. So temperament has been defined in various ways by various temperament researchers, but this Rothbard and Derryberry definition has become sort of the norm with some tweaks. So temperament is defined as constitutional differences in reactivity and self-regulation, reactivity being the infant's reactions to changes in the environment, and regulation, the process to modulate reactivity through such behaviors as attention and behavioral patterns of approach withdrawal. Now, I've emphasized approach withdrawal here because I'll be focusing on this particular process as it really underpins our interests in linking it to infants' reactions to new foods. Now, in terms of agreement among temperament researchers, and there's a lot of disagreement, there are actually 4 principles that they do agree on. One is that temperament represents individual differences. I think we all can agree on that. Another is that temperament is constitutionally based, so it has some innateness to it. Another is that temperament is manifested in behaviors that have temporal intensive characteristics. That means how long a reaction is and how strong it is. And then finally, and this is one principle of temperament that people either don't understand or misunderstand or don't know about, and that's the fact that the temperament actually develops. I think there's a misunderstanding because we think of it as being stable, and the expectation is that somehow, if your child is highly reactive, then they're going to be a highly reactive preschooler. Well, that's not true necessarily, because for one, reactivity does change over time, where the characteristics of intensive and temporal variations is great in young kids, but as they get older, you're actually seeing less reactivity, shorter periods of reactivity and less intense. So, and usually we think of that development occurring because self-regulation is developing over time. So kids are able to control their reactions and they become less reactive or look less reactive. So that this principle of temperament develops is an important one, particularly in some of the research that we've been doing. So finally, as I mentioned, this central process underlying temperament of approach withdrawal and the emotions that occur along with it has been of particular interest to my lab. And so I've wanted to discuss briefly how we measure this. So child temperament can be measured in a variety of ways. The most popular, of course, being using parent ratings of temperament. It's popular for a number of reasons, and it's actually the one, at least currently, the only method that current research in temperament and childhood obesity has been using. It's easy to administer, and it doesn't cost very much. The second method, which is used less often, but a lot of us do this, is observations of behavior and emotions in response to varying tasks when we bring them into the laboratory. And then a third way is something that we've devised recently, is a sort of in-between method. It's between It's an observer, but the observer is rating temperament on several scales when they're observing the kid across an entire laboratory visit. So even from entry into the lab all the way through the lab visit as well, including transitions. So we're getting sort of a flavor of temperament, but not digging down as we do when we code behaviors typically. So we have found that to be extremely effective. Let's see. Now, in terms of questionnaire data, and most temperament researchers have now been using this Rothbard series of questionnaires, she's found 3 super factors through a variable-oriented approach. Negativity, which is a composite of all negative emotions, variations in negative emotions, fear, anger, sadness. Surgency, which is basically an impulsive, highly active, high-intensity pleasure, approach-oriented, definite, I don't want to say type, but we do say type, but it's a super factor. And then the third one is regulation, so that's really about attention focusing, shifting, and inhibitory control. So those 3 things have come up that have been used, very popular in the literature. And for this observer ratings, we've also developed a composite of surgency using approaches to novel persons, positive affect activity level, and we look at the variability from low to high surgency. And then finally, there is a person-oriented analysis that we've adopted based on laboratory behaviors. And again, it's approach withdrawal behaviors as well as the affect that's associated with approach and withdrawal. And we have derived 3 types: the inhibited type, which is high in fear, and low in approach or high in withdrawal. The exuberant type, which we're calling exuberant in this case instead of surgent, since that's sort of proprietary. Exuberant, which is the high positive and approaching, and then the average approach. I should say that we measure that approach withdrawal typically in risk rooms where we have a lot of novelty. So novelty is really that thing that pulls for approach withdrawal behaviors. Okay, enough about temperament. So at Penn State, I was fortunate to have a colleague, Leanne Birch, that is mentioned by Julie, who's one of the foremost developmental researchers in infant feeding. We talked a lot about how child characteristics might contribute to the feeding interaction, which got me to thinking about whether the role of temperament in feeding and thus childhood obesity. So from my discussions with Leanne and a review of the literature and some serendipitous results that I'm going to report about a little bit later, I started a project examining the role of temperament in feeding and risk for childhood obesity. We call the Back to Baby Basics research project. We didn't want to include obesity in the name of the project or anything like that. All of you who have labs here know you don't want to give away what you're studying. So baby basics sounded really good. Eating, feeding, sleeping, crying. There you go. Baby basics. So we had many questions of the data, but the 2 of them I'm going to talk about today. One is, does temperament underlie responses to novel foods? And again, temperament meaning approach withdrawal processes in this case. And the second is temperament or child temperament a risk factor for childhood obesity, or does its impact depend upon certain parenting feeding practices? And that will be the second half of the talk. Now, it's interesting that it's the nutrition literature that actually has a label for reactions to novel foods, negative reactions to novel foods, called neophobia. And neophobia is defined as fear, distress, or reluctance to eat a new food. It typically emerges around when solids are introduced, so that's about 6 months typically. It's related to poorer diets and less dietary variety, as you might imagine. It appears to persist into childhood, preschool, for some children. And then finally, and I think this is important, it's distinguished from picky eating. So neophobia is new foods, whereas picky eating is getting poor nutrition from both familiar and unfamiliar foods. So they're two different kinds of reactions. We haven't looked at picky eating, but we have looked at neophobia quite a bit. In fact, I'll be talking about that in a second. So our first question was about the role of temperament in their infants' reactions to new foods, which we hypothesized that the introduction of new food would elicit these approach withdrawal tendencies. To test this hypothesis, my former grad student Cameron Modi, who's now a colleague and now at Purdue, we designed a study to examine this longitudinally. That's what we do, longitudinal work. So to assess approach withdrawal responses, we did a novel food task when kids were 6 months and 12 months of age. And the familiar food, first we asked the parent to bring a familiar food, and they would feed that to the baby, 3 spoonfuls, and then they would switch to a novel food. And that novel food at 6 months was green beans or hummus, and at 12 months it was hummus or cottage cheese. Of course, we asked the parent, had the child tasted this food before? And also, it's important to note that at 6 months, there are some kids who still hadn't been introduced to solid food, so they, of course, did not participate in this particular task. So from the videotapes, we videotaped it, we coded facial and behavioral reactions, and they were sort of negativity, spitting out the food, turning away, behaviors like this little kid here, and we created a composite of acceptance rejection. And that's the way the nutritionists call it, acceptance rejection. Okay. So, does temperament underlie infant responses to novel foods? We had 3 goals. The first goal was to compare the development of approach withdrawal to novel toys, which is something that we've done typically, novel objects, to acceptance rejection of novel foods. And so we had a novel toy task in which the parent introduced 3 toys of increasing intensity, and we coded their reactions to that. And then we were interested in seeing the development of these behaviors from 6 to 12 months. And this was based on a study by Rothbard that I replicated with Sam Putnam, where we introduced high intensity and low intensity toys to these little kids. They're sitting in a high chair, and the high intensity toy was like a moving wind-up toy that had sparks and stuff like that. It was very fun. So at 6 months, if you can see by this graph, that's very clear. At 6 months, there wasn't any variability in approach. Most kids approached the toy about the same, whether it was low or high intensity. Okay? Even though there was a bit of a difference, that was not significant. Okay? And this was latency to touch. So their latencies to touch were fairly similar to the high and low intensity toys. But if you can see at 12 months, the latencies got longer for the high intensity toys, but shorter for the low intensity. And we attributed this to the emergence of inhibited approach. So we thought that the same thing would happen with novel foods, that at 6 months, they would show very little difference in acceptance, meaning that they would be more accepting, and then show less acceptance or more rejection by 12 months. So that was our first reasoning, or our first question. The second was to examine the concurrent relationship between reactions to novel toys to reactions to novel foods. And then thirdly, we wanted to see if 6 and 12 month reactions to novel foods was related to temperament measured 12 and 6 months later. So did novel foods predict temperament? Okay, so did it have a developmental pattern? Was it concurrently associated? And did it predict? And I am so happy to report that we were right, but there's a developmental piece to this. Okay. So here you can see, and I should say that the metric is different. On the y-axis, we have approach scores, and then you see that there's change over time. So, but at 6 months, kids were more accepting or more approaching of the novel toys and more accepting of the novel food. But at 12 months, you can see at least a very steep difference with the novel foods. Both of these lines were significant, and to toys. So they showed the same developmental pattern or a shift from acceptance to more rejection. Lots of variation though. And if it was between 6 and 12 months. And some of you may know that this is actually a developmental shift in terms of fear. That's when self-locomotion emerges and the emotion of fear emerges. So the conclusion is that this inhibited approach is causing children to be more hesitant, at least not all of them, of course, to novel foods as well as novel toys, which we had demonstrated before. Okay. The concurrent relationship was also significant. This is also important, but only for 12 months. So the shift is being confirmed. At 6 months, there's no relationship, but at 12 months there is. So they're being consolidated. This sort of temperament relationships across context, or if you want to call it context or situation, is more significant at 12 months. Still low, but we're talking about babies. This is pretty good, actually, 0.2 for a baby. And then thirdly, we found a longitudinal relationship, significant again, for 12 months and not 6 months. So 12-month food acceptance was related to both 18-month approach in the risk room and exuberant temperament type. So I'm very interested in this and concluded that these findings indicate that temperament may underlie acceptance, rejections, responses to novel foods, and may indeed be reflecting temperament in these feeding interactions. So this, what we're seeing and what the mother is experiencing or the father or the caregiver is experiencing is a child's temperament that's driving their acceptance and rejection. Okay. So very quickly, we did look at temperament and neophobia being a specific response to novel foods. And in this case, we looked at whether temperament at 18 months, so the same risk room temperament, was related to neophobia later. As I said, it sort of solidifies in preschool, but for certain kids. And we did a novel food task at 4.5, where we gave them we showed them 5 different foods, 3 of which were novel, and asked them if they'd like to taste it. And so we just recorded their acceptance or rejection of an opportunity to taste it. And then we got mother-reported neophobia. And then we, again, looked at the concurrent relationship between temperament and, in this case, neophobia. And we had 4.5-year approach behaviors in a risk room, which, of course, was much more sophisticated and maybe scary than the 18-month risk room. And mothers rated their temperament. So I had two measures of temperament, mothers' ratings, and the child's approach behaviors from a risk room. And again, sometimes things just fall into place and you're like, well, maybe that was obvious, but wasn't reported then. Okay, so the longitudinal relationship was significant for 18-month negative affect during the risk room, which we interpreted as being fearfulness. And it was for both observed neophobia and mother-rated neophobia. And then the concurrent relationship was significant for 4.5-year low approach, meaning kids who showed low approach in the 4.5-year risk room with 4.5-year neophobia, and mother-rated negativity. And quite obviously, mother-rated negativity was related to mother-rated neophobia. I should say that we also looked at parent feeding practices, and there was an interaction with mother-rated 18-month negativity in the lab to the risk room and pressure to eat. So you can see in this graph that kids who showed fearfulness in the lab, so we would consider them inhibited or highly negative to novelty, who had mothers who pressured them to eat, had a very significant high level of neophobia. So it was a combination of 2 things that could make it difficult for kids who are already fearful. So you may ask yourself, wait a minute, did you ask the question, is 6-month and 12-month responses to novel foods related to neophobia? And my answer to you is, yes, we did. And we found, can you guess? Not 6 months, but 12-month responses to novel foods was related to neophobia. Okay. So we have a very consistent set of analyses here, which we've come to the takeaway, where collectively I think our data suggests that temperament may underlie responses to new foods, because there's consistent evidence of this developmental shift to novelty. And that developmental shift has also been seen in researchers who do acceptance of novel foods. So they talk about this developmental shift in the nutrition literature. The acceptance of novel foods, we know from, at least from our data, decreases with the emergence of inhibited approach, taking a temperament perspective. And then while during the preschool years, when neophobia becomes entrenched in some children, those children who are neophobic tend to be inhibited kids. Let's go ahead next. So research on acceptance, that Julie had just mentioned this. Research on acceptance of novel foods suggests that you should have infants take 8 to 10 exposures to get used to or before they accept a new food. So the question is, what about inhibited kids? What is it going to take 8 to 10 or not? And so I think the message that we would send to parents of inhibited kids is that you need to persist with eating the novel food. Don't take the reactions, the negative facial expressions, because they really do show disgust expression, and continue to try the novel food, or as nutritionists suggest, try small portions of novel foods or pair it with a familiar food. And maybe you'll get the inhibited kid to start eating. And you can. I mean, as Julie mentioned, you can learn to eat and like the foods that you didn't like before. So it's a learned process. But I think it's important to tell parents to keep in mind that when they do respond, how they respond to the novel food is not necessarily the food itself, although there might be sensitivities to texture and taste, but some of it, at least, is the fact that they're wary of new things, and so you need to get them used to the idea. So that, I think, is a takeaway. So moving on, and this is for the grad students. I promised them this. So as Esther mentioned, most of my work has been looking at the psychophysiological correlates as well as the socio-emotional outcomes of temperament. And at that time, when I was looking at temperament and reactivity and regulation, at least other regulation, I was really interested in parent soothing methods, and I was wanting to see which methods were effective. So in order to get your whole sample to be distressed to the same thing, you can't do what we typically did, is hold your arms down, introduce them to an intense toy, because you have kids who approach and kids who reject or withdraw. So, and I didn't want to inflict pain on any kids. So we decided that we would videotape infants receiving their immunization shots at 2 months and 6 months. So we were able to go and videotape parents soothing their infants after they received a shot. And from that data, you can imagine the intensity of the coding. We coded every 5 seconds the level of the infant's distress and the soothing methods that the parent was using in that 5 seconds. And in the first case, we did a very simple contingency analysis. Does the second 5 in 2 5-second intervals, is there a change in decrease? And we found that both holding rocking, which is the same thing, sort of vestibular sorts of movement, and vocalizations were very effective. But another interesting soothing method emerged, and not so surprisingly, which is that giving them food or giving them pacifier reduces distress. So no surprise, but what happened later, and this was just a few years later, a colleague of mine was looking for some time series data to do a hidden Markov model, and I happened to have these 5-second data of multiple variables over 4 minutes. That to a statistician is big data. Well, then it was big data, now big data is something totally different. But anyway, he ran hidden Markov modeling as a time series method that creates latent states from multiple variables so that you're able to combine levels of distress and multiple soothing techniques in one latent state and learn something about what's going on, what's effective. What was interesting about this particular, both of them actually, 2 months and 6 months emerged, was a state specifically for feeding. So a state specifically for parents who use food, okay, to soothe their infants. Sorry, I'm walking away from the microphone. It's probably distorted. So here is a graph, and I have to explain this because if you look at the y-axis, it doesn't look like the red line is the number of dyads that use food to soothe. Okay? So if you look at the first 50, 60 seconds, not very many parents use food to soothe. Okay? Now, this number of dyads, what it doesn't look like very much, is the number of dyads that were still soothing. Okay, so it doesn't include the ones that succeeded in calming their infants. That's an important variable, right? So as time goes on, more and more dyads are choosing to use food to soothe. Okay? Not a lot, but remember, once they use food to soothe, it works. We all know that food is very effective in stopping crying. But yet the numbers increase. What does that tell you? They tried a lot of soothing techniques and turned to food, right? So that's basically food. What we were thinking of is food to soothe in a non-hunger context. So the parent did not interpret their crying immediately, and these are kids who are really crying, did not interpret their crying as hunger. So, and they tried all these other soothing techniques, and then they used food. So I thought, wow, I mean, it's got its own state. It's very dramatic in terms of the pattern. And so I was wondering, food to soothe in non-hunger context, what could be the consequences for a parent who uses that particular parent feeding method in this way? So this was the second part of the study, the back feeding basics. So food to soothe is a parenting feeding technique or a food parenting technique seen in the childhood obesity literature, which has been studying parenting feeding practices for many years, and it's clear why. It's a modifiable factor. It's something that you can target for interventions. So the findings of these studies indicate that some methods of food parenting are detrimental. So, for example, parent restriction of foods, which is keeping them from eating certain foods, actually leads to them eating the foods that you're restricting and to weight gain. And parent pressuring, as you saw, is related to neophobia, but it's also related to picky eating. Responsive parenting, on the other hand, where you provide a balanced diet and you're very responsive to hunger cues and satiety cues, has a positive outcome, healthy eating and healthy weight. So these particular parenting practices, food parenting practices, are practices around feeding. They're not practices that necessarily are related to the infant's reactivity. But food to soothe, which is another, is a food parenting practice that has been measured, as well as food as a reward, are ones that are tied intimately to the reactivity level of the child, right? So the child's doing something that they're distressed, or they're not doing a task, or they want something and you don't want to give it to them. You need to distract them away from it. Using food in those contexts is tied to the child, whereas the other feeding practices are really sort of beliefs. This is how I think I should be feeding the child. I restrict the food, I push them to eat, and so forth. So this was very ripe for the study of these practices. And if the parent is using these practices, the ones that are tied to the child's reactivity, and they are tied to non-hunger contexts, so it's food to soothe when the child's not hungry, then these practices may lead the child to override their appetite signals and use other things to tell them when it's time to eat or that they want food. And that could lead to overeating and subsequent weight gain. So just really quick background on research and temperament on infant and child weight outcomes. There was very little interest about 20 years ago, with the exception of Bill Carey, who was a developmental pediatrician who worked in the early temperament area. And in the infant literature, there's quite a bit of work now in the last 20 years. It's really been a nice sort of resurgence of this interest in looking at child characteristics related to childhood obesity. Now, these are correlational studies, direct relationships that have been discovered. And you can see here that difficultness, negative emotionality, sort of super factors. But when people looked at more what we call sort of the dimensional approach in terms of what made up the negative emotionality, it seemed to be distress to limitations. I have that up here, but actually what that is anger reactivity. It's another word for anger in young babies, is distress to limitation. And you can see there are a number of studies that actually found anger reactivity to be directly related to rapid weight gain, which is a risk factor for childhood obesity, or greater weight status. And then surgency, which is a characteristic of an approach orientation and high intense activity and positivity, is also related to weight gain in infants. What's interesting is when we look at the data on children, you see the same thing: difficultness, negative emotionality being related to greater weight in children, but also reward sensitivity and novelty seeking. So this was extremely interesting to me because taken together, these all seem to form the surgent child. Now you may say, wait a minute, distress and limitations or anger reactivity is part of negative emotionality. Why should it be part of surgency? Well, here's the deal. First of all, just from a factor analysis standpoint, so Rothbard came up with this surgeon super factor. And if you look at the data, anger reactivity, distress and limitations, and anger reactivity in later children loads on both negative emotionality and surgency. To me, this made sense. We're talking about an approach-oriented kid, a kid who's more approach-oriented, interested in novelty, wants to do something, is going to be blocked many times by their parent. You can't have everything you want. You can't touch everything you want. You can't eat everything you want. So they're going to get blocked. What's the response to being blocked? Anger. So it made sense that it was distress to limitations that would be related to other variables of surgency that are related to weight. So reward sensitivity, for example, is in adulthood related to adult obesity, and novelty seeking is basically the thing that underlies surgency. So seeking out novelty, wanting to interact with novelty. So taking these together, we began to, think about how food to soothe and temperament might interact to predict risk for childhood obesity, and specifically wasn't hypothesizing that it would be surgent kids who would be at most risk under the condition of food to soothe. So again, back to the Baby Basics Project. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We know that it was 6, 12, and 18 months. We had so we created a food to soothe questionnaire, but we also did a 3-day diary, which I'll explain in a second. So we measured food to soothe a couple of times. We had observation ratings, as I mentioned before, and we had observations in the laboratory. And in the laboratory, we also looked at food to soothe in situ. In other words, these are hour and a half long labs. And at 6 and 12 months, we didn't tell the mother to bring food, but almost always, for those of you who have kids, you always have food with you if you're going out. So we watched when the infant cried and whether parent used food, and we controlled for time since last fed. So if it was a long time, it would be hunger. A short time, that was controlled for. And then at 18 months, we had a snack tray because it was a long visit. We put a snack tray there. We didn't say anything. Just, it's there for you, period. And then we coded how often. We coded a lot of things, but, when, how long, what they ate, and so forth. So we converted that to a measure of food to soothe at 18 months. So, and then of course we weighed them and we measured their length. So in terms of this diary, we really asked a lot of our moms. This is a 3-day diary where we divide each of those things as different times of the day, morning, afternoon, evening, and night, and they're broken down into 5-minute segments. But they did it. They were supposed to color in for all the different states that we wanted them to report, which was awakening, content, sleeping, crying, fussing, and feeding. So we had, the important 3 are crying, fussing, and feeding. And so we asked them for every cry bout to fill out one of these scales, but it's not scale, it's just a rank order. What did you do first? What did you do second? What did you do third until the child was calmed? Now it wasn't like there was like 12 of these little graphs on this one page, so it wasn't a lot of paperwork. And so we use that as a measure of food to soothe. Now, you're saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, if the baby cried and the mother fed right after the baby's cry, the baby could be hungry. We agree. This is what's so difficult about food to soothe, is how to know if the mother's responding to hunger or is the mother turning to food to soothe. So in this case, we operationalize food to soothe as higher rank order. So an average of the rank orders, ones that would be higher would be food to soothe, ones that would be low would be food to soothe the child or to feed the child's hunger, right? If you know that it's time for the child to eat, you give them food right away. You don't wait, you don't do some other soothing technique before you feed them. You're gonna feed them first, right? But if you don't think, like they just ate, or some other, it's a short time since they ate, then you might try other soothing techniques. Maybe you'll think that they are hungry. That would be natural. Oh, he must be hungry. And then you feed them soothe. But the point is that you waited that long. So you didn't think that immediately after the child cried. So we consider that the higher average ranking. Does that make sense? It's sort of the words don't seem to come out very well for me, but anyway, that was our measure of food to soothe. And so we, again, as I said before, we hypothesized that surging kids whose parents use food to soothe would be at risk for childhood obesity. And in this case, we were interested in looking at infant rapid weight gain from 6 to 18 months. And lo and behold, I'm happy to report, actually we published this, that both parent-rated surgency, we used both parent-rated and observer-rated surgency, both of them came out positive for high average food to soothe, high average rank order, and high surgency. You can see that both were significant slopes, so that kids who were high in surgency, whose parents used food to soothe or waited and used other techniques between soothing, had greater weight gain from 6 to 8 months. This is a difference change score, Z change score. So then, this is back to Baby Basics Kids. We were very fortunate to have funding from NIDDK to follow our kids into preschool. So when they turned 4.5 and 5.5 years of age, we had them come back in. I've mentioned a couple of tasks. We had a risk room and we had a novel food task, but we also had a snack tray. And this snack tray is important to note that it had both nutritious and non-nutritious foods on it. And again, we just introduced it, said, we're just going to leave it here. It's a long visit, walk away. Okay? We also, so in this case, we were looking at food to soothe, but we were also interested in food to change behavior or reward behavior. These are 4.5-year-olds, so it's more likely to use that, particularly given that they were doing tasks. We were asking them to do executive function tasks and science experiments and things like that. We had them do a whole bunch of things, most of them centered around novelty, some of them centered around regulation. So it's a long day for them, and it really did pull for either not bad behavior, but non-compliance and boredom, things like that. And so we call that combining both food to soothe and food to change behavior or reward behavior is instrumental feeding. And then for kids who did it themselves, we call it instrumental eating, because the kids obviously could choose to go and take a snack as well. So in this case, we looked at approaching or eating the food as interest in the food, negative affect, and then we looked at the circumstances leading up to that. So negative affect, rewarding behavior, which the parents would do, and then boredom or disinterest in the task, to see if those things were followed by being interested in the food. And then, of course, we had ratings of surgency, both from mothers and observers. We had BMI, and then we had covariates that we used in this next analysis I'm going to share with you. And in this case, we had a model. We were very interested in this developmental cascade. We don't think that there is a direct relationship between temperament and child outcomes, and we don't think that there is necessarily a direct relationship between parent feeding practices and weight. Rather, we thought this relationship was mediated by the child's learning instrumental eating. So in other words, mother's early instrumental feeding, food to soothe in particular, but food to change and reward behavior, would translate for some kids into instrumental eating. That means I decide, I'm upset, I want food. So making that association would then lead to child weight. However, we thought that was moderated by surgency. So that pathway, that developmental cascade, would only be for those who were high in surgency. I'm always going to report to you things that are great that come out. And sure enough, the interaction between surgency and mother's early, that was at 18 months, instrumental feeding, did lead to greater child instrumental eating and child instrumental eating related to child weight for child surgency, high child surgency. So the developmental cascade came out. We're very excited. This is brand new data, so I'm very excited about this. This is a plot for the first interaction, so you can see that kids who are high in surgency were more likely to participate in instrumental eating if their mothers who had participated in instrumental feeding at 18 months. And then here's the plot for surgency and child eating related to weight. So you can see again, the high surgeon kids who typically used in the lab, used instrumental eating were more likely to be heavier than kids who did not. Okay. So takeaway, child temperament, specifically surgency, we think is a risk factor for childhood obesity, but only if their parents use food to soothe or reward or change behavior. Now, surgeon kids, we think, are probably evoking the use of food to soothe from their parents due to their approach orientation. They may be more at risk because they're more likely to make the association between food and feeling good or comforted because of their reward sensitivity. So if it happens, you go, oh, good, feels good. I'm not distressed anymore. Food, so they might be making that association more easily than a kid who's low in surgency. Because my sense is that the low surgeon kid just goes, they don't make that association. No reward sensitivity. So consequently, they may turn to food for that feeling that they themselves, they make the association if the parent does it, and then they turn to it themselves. And turning to food when you're distressed is called an emotional eater. And emotional eaters are people who tend to become adults with obesity. Oh, sorry. That's everything I just said. Now, I want to finally harken back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and I think this is an important thing to remember because I haven't really talked about time or the dynamic because we haven't measured it in that way. But it's important to keep in mind that many of the transactions between parents and their children around food, while very frustrating, I know, are what I call instances of parenting in the moment. So when the kid's upset because they don't get what they want, or because they're tired, or for whatever, the parent reacts in the moment. The kid is driving, it is contributing to, in this interaction, contributing to the outcome, okay? So whether it's hard crying or oppositional behavior, that does not in and of itself represent a dysfunctional dynamic. You can't take one instance and go, okay, that kid's gonna be heavy when they grow up. Okay? So, and those of your parents know you just have to go with the flow. It's sort of, you have to do it at that moment. That's what I call parenting in the moment. However, it may be that if parents and children continue this interaction over time, then the risk for dysregulated eating and overweight obesity increases. I want to acknowledge my funding, my colleagues, and my former graduate students who, as Esther said, are all off doing really good things. These are the ones that worked in the project. And I want to thank you all very much for inviting me. That's exuberance, by the way. That's the way I feel when I'm finished with a talk.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and we have some time for questions. If anyone in the audience have questions, if you want to come up to one of the microphones, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can also see what's going on Zoom. If folks have questions there too. Okay, I see a question on Zoom from Jessica. I'm going to unmute this computer so that I can hear you. And okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious about just kind of circular, or sorry, really echoing over the cyclic nature of the continued issue of the parent responsibility in this way over time, and that's going to create the issue. But I'm curious about what parent is contributing to that. So are there certain parental circumvent factors that if those are the parents that be more likely to exacerbate that cycle over time? If the kids have a surgery, that parent's also high in activity, perhaps, they'd be more likely to get a surgery because they're sending up their own emotions in that circumstance as well.
That's a really, really good question. We don't measure parent temperament, and I can imagine that there's that alone would create conflict because they're both, they're both approach oriented, and the mother might have different beliefs or desires to get the kid to do a particular thing. But I think I'm not so sure it would be a similar thing in terms of the parent surgeon and the kid surgeon, because again, I think it's really what the child's evoking from the parent, and it could very well be. Now, it may be more intense, or even maybe it's more empathic. We don't know. But that's a very good question. And we have controlled for some maternal variables, but of course, those are things like BMI, education, and those sorts of things. So really, when we look at them, and of course, our sample was fairly educated, and so there wasn't any differences in that respect. A good question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk today. One question that I had in my mind, like at the end of your talk, was your work tends to focus on obesity as eating dysregulation. Is there any work on other dysregulated eating habits, like purging?
There certainly is in the literature. There's quite a bit on that, but no, in terms of because we're working with kids. the outcomes are basically, you know, logically, I guess, from feeding to childhood obesity. And I always talk about risk for childhood obesity. It's just that they may be on the high end of weight. Some of them are overweight and obese in terms of being over the 85th percentile. But in terms of other kinds of feed, we always ask them if they have feed, not the parents, but the kids, if they have trouble with eating or feeding and that sort of thing. And again, those things we look to control for when we're trying to look at these relationships, but not in terms of other sort of serious feeding disorders. Yeah. Long day.
You mentioned you measured this, but I don't recall, you might have already explained this, I can't remember if you presented the data from this, but is there also a difference in the kind of food that surgeon is being offered? Because they're kind of looking for that, maybe like high, like are they eating more of these like sweet foods to kind of like 15 to 2 pots?
Yeah.
And then they have a stronger reaction to those sweet foods so that it actually is regulating their emotions, maybe you don't think it might not for the other children.
Yeah.
So is it kind of more than just urgency, but also like actually affecting their regulatory state and their
That's a really good question, and we're in the process of looking at things like that because, well, you know, it sort of breaks down, you know, when your numbers go way down, is what are they eating? What are the children choosing? So we're just now getting more into the weeds, you know, in terms of maybe they are just picking an apple rather than something sweet, but still the outcome still remains the same. So it's really that sort of food interest, or I think there's an appetitive definition for kids who have real interest in food. Do you know what that's called? I forget. From the nutrition field, they talk about they really have an appetitive disposition. They're interested in food. And so it may be that it's just that approach orientation, not the food itself. But if the, you know, we don't know. We have measures of the food environment in the home, and that would be another thing to look at. Are parents likely to have more nutritious or non-nutritious things in the home, and is that related to use of food to see for this kid, and is that what they're being exposed to?
Sorry, I just want to follow up quickly. I was thinking of some, I study ownership and like physical objects. I was thinking of some like really old work looking at like after vaccination, children that were given their attachment objects versus a similar object actually show like true like regulation, like they're decreasing like their physiological distress markers, so like the vaccine. So I was just kind of thinking about that because researching kids and they actually show like these actually differences and responses to food, like physical responses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting idea.
I was just wondering what maybe like childbirth order would play in parents' use of like student strategies. So I don't know, the parental strategies supposedly change for children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering.
Yeah. No, we've looked at so many covariates, and nothing seems to be emerging. It's really not even. Well, education, maternal education always emerges, and then sometimes mothers weight, but things like birth order, gender, none of these things emerge. Again, these are young, these are young kids, and so that's likely one of the reasons. And they have siblings, but some of them don't. And we probably should go back and look at that firstborn versus laterborn and see if there isn't anything. But so far, nothing.
Maybe grandma. Strategies.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Let me just gonna take a peek and see if anyone on Zoom has any questions. If you want to raise your hand and I'll call on you. or I'll put it, or if you want to put it in the chat, I can read it out. And if anyone else in the audience wants to come and ask this question, and if not, I have a question that I will jump in with in the meantime. I see Stephanie has a raised hand, so let me unmute
Can I?
the computer. Yeah.
Hi, Stephanie.
Stephanie worked with me.
Nice to see you. I really enjoyed the talk a lot.
Thanks, Steph.
I have a question about the idea. So I've been thinking about coming at it from a different angle with this idea that repeated exposure might not work the same way for all kids.
Right.
And I think this is an idea that's sort of starting to emerge in different literatures, but it's a hard message to communicate from a public health perspective, where repeated exposure has been upheld as this like really effective strategy. So do you have any ideas about how to communicate? Like, do people know when they have inhibited kid? How to communicate when repeated exposure might not be the best strategy?
Right. Well, certainly one would think, given the developmental shift, that you would want to start this introduction of new foods early. But you can only introduce so many new foods. But the inhibited kid is not going to be accepting them, and so it may take longer. But again, the inhibited kid is not fully inhibited until sort of after this shift. So you may, again, the data suggests that you can get a lot of acceptance before this self-locomotion and fear emergence and inhibited approach emergence. But again, it's such a time limit, so is that appropriate to actually introduce a lot of new foods before they start rejecting the food? So I think we still have to deal with the fact that these kids are different in terms of how they're going to approach food. There are just going to be some kids who don't like it for several reasons. I'm not just saying all inhibited kids aren't, because inhibited kids actually change over time as well. They develop strategies and they know how to deal with novelty later. But at this critical period, when you're trying to get them to accept new foods, you're going to have to work harder, I think. If it's exposure, if it's playfulness, I don't know. I think that's a good question for future research for all your graduate students, is what is it that you can do to get kids, particularly kids who are rejecting of new foods, to get there faster so that their exposure to a variety is good and their diet is good, rather than giving up. I think that's the message. Don't give up because of who they are. I don't know. Does that answer your question? She's talking.
Hold on, Stephanie. Let me put you back on the sound. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's something you can just anecdotally, unless your parents say, I know I'm supposed to do repeated exposure, I did that, it didn't work. So it'd be great to be able to give these families split and say, oh yeah, it doesn't work for all kids, here are some other tools you can try.
Right. But what are they? Right. I think it's important to not evoke fear in the kids. That's the important thing. But if you can make it fun and quiet, I think. But again, it's something that they're ingesting, and it's a surprise, and then they hate it or they spit it out. So it really is one of those feeding interactions that are very frustrating, because I was talking to the grad students that parents, this is the one interaction that's necessary. You just can't get away from it as a parent. You must feed your child. So it's so much conflict within the parent. I have to feed the child, and if I can't get them to feed, I feel bad about myself. I must not be a good mother or a parent. So what are you supposed to do? You can't not feed them. And, as long as we keep educating parents about variety, how important it is, then we have to back that up with methods for what's the best way to get them to accept them for particular kinds of kids. That's the thing about temperament. It really does suggest that it's not the same for everybody. And we have to be more thoughtful about developing methods for these kinds of important developmental tasks, like introduction of new foods. Yeah.
And we have a question over here on this side. Oh, sorry, Cynthia.
It's hard to see.
Thank you. Very interesting data. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the novel food tasks. How important is the way that the food is presented to the child play a role in how they accept it?
Yeah, I think I always get worried about questions that are only perhaps addressed with experimental research. And because I'm a developmental researcher and interested in sort of individual differences, I can't do an experiment, and so all we can do is just break it down and look at how parents feed and try and figure out what works with certain kids. And again, this would be something we could do with our data, but it's not, I can't answer the question about what kind of way of delivery is better than another, or would it get them to accept the food better, with not more strict experimental design. So we can look at our videotapes and break it down. I think that's a good idea, but it does beg the question too, how sensitive are the parents to their dispositions of their child as well? I mean, they rate them on their temperament, but I sometimes think, boy, we're adding so many variables to all this thing that are, it's going to be hard to sort of dig down that way. But I like that idea. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm so fascinated by your game dialing method of measuring distress and then rank ordering soothing behaviors. I'm curious about whether I've looked at textual factors like time of day or kind of the time course of how parents choose their soothing methods, or for any other kind of individual difference factors that affect maybe kind of the pattern or change in soothing over the course of the day or over the course of one distressing event.
Right. I love these questions because all it does is say, I have to go back to the data. And the good news is we have the data. It's sort of this one way, it's like, oh, this is great. But then on the other hand, it's like overwhelming because of all these so interesting questions. And so that's something that we did not consider. I think the time of day is a very interesting effect that probably does affect how quickly they respond, or whether they just go right to food because they're tired, for example, and they don't want to do any more sleeping, they don't want to get to that point. And that's why I think very much about parenting in the moment, because it really does, there's so many factors that are going into the parent's response, including the child's temperament, but other things too, tiredness, context, age, I don't know, tons of things that go into making these decisions in the moment that we wouldn't normally do. So that's why I was telling Esther about a questionnaire. Sometimes I think that they underreport the use of food to soothe. But boy, that's why I was worried about the questionnaire, because it's not related to the laboratory measure of food to soothe. Parents use food to soothe much more than they say they do. But that's not surprising either. They say, oh, I don't do that. And again, it's back sort of into the moment kind of thing. Of course, their belief is not to use food to soothe. Of course, they know they shouldn't do that, but they do. They do it quite often. So, my aim, or the things I like to do, is try to get to can we get to that? But let's try and get to it as close as we can, because I don't think we're ever going to get to it. What's their motivation? If they're tired or not. But time of day is a way to get around the question of tiredness. I like all these ideas.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for these amazing talks that we've had today. I really appreciate everybody's thoughtful questions and our participation here in the EUC and also on Zoom and around on the web. I think that will close us off for today. And I will see you all back here tomorrow at 9 for 2 more really exciting talks, and then a little discussion about what we've taken away from the whole experience. Thank you. That was such a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I'll save my question for later on.
I loved it. You think